Good afternoon, all. Yeah, my name is Kerry Cooper. I'm the co-chair of the National Forum for Health and Wellbeing, and there's going to be plenty of members from the National Forum at this meeting, both online and in person. The National Forum, by the way, was formed about 5.5 years ago of leading companies. We have 45 global and national bodies in it, very senior people, and we look at health and well-being. We actually do things like this event is doing something. It's looking at one of the major topic areas, one of the main strategies that many organizations have, which is mental health first aiding. We're wanting to look at the evidence, what works, what doesn't work. And I wanted to really thank Charles Albert for his idea, who's one of the forum members, Charles Albert from Clifford Chance, for kind of bringing this all together and hosting the day, as it were, so that we can look at the evidence and see how it works and what good looks like in this kind of context. Unfortunately, I can't be there because I have a hospital treatment during the week, and Peter Cheese, the CEO of CIPD, will be chairing much of the day along with Charles Albert. It's going to be an interesting one. I also like to thank the team who put this program together, the team from the National Forum who've been working with Charles. And we really have a good, good collection of people. Susanna Robertson, who will talk about the research. She did her PhD on this topic. And then we have a really wonderful, varied panel who will be, looking at all the issues and working with you interactively to kind of look at the evidence, think what good looks like, and where we go from here. Anyway, have a wonderful day. I'm sure you're going to enjoy it, and I'm sad I can't be there, but I'll be with you in spirit.
So that was Carrie. You all know Carrie, right? So I'm Peter Cheese. As Carrie said, I'm going to be helping to chair and facilitate today, and it's a real privilege to do it. So a little bit about myself first and foremost. So I've been the chief executive of the CIPD for the last 10 years or so, but well-being, which is the professional body for HR, but well-being to me has always been one of my real passions. I've worked in lots of different areas of well-being over the years. I also chair the What Works Centre for Wellbeing, engaged in lots of the debates, lots of the different forums, and have been one of the founder members of Carrie's forum. And Carrie and I have worked together as colleagues over the years. We're good friends, and we all send our best wishes to Carrie. And I know he'll be back with us very, very shortly. Secondly, I want to thank Charles and Clifford Chance. What a wonderful amphitheatre this is. Recognise we are in a Magic Circle law firm, so anything you say may be taken. But in all seriousness, Charles, so much for hosting us here. I don't think there are any logistics or things I have to point at or alarm bells that are going to go off. So I guess if an alarm bell goes off, we run like hell in that direction out of the room. But in any event, a really, really important session this afternoon. And as Carrie said, the emphasis on the National Forum has always been about doing things and getting people together and sharing stories. And the particular focus today around mental health, which we know is one of the more challenging, but probably the most critical areas of debate now in the whole wellbeing space. And certainly in my experience over the last 5 or 6 years here, prior to the pandemic, we were seeing mental health and wellbeing coming much more onto the corporate agenda. And whilst wellbeing in the past was so often talked about in the aspects of things like physical health, I often used to phrase it very simply that if I came into work, certainly when I started work, and came in with a sniveling cold or something, my boss would say, go home and sort yourself out. If I came into work and I was all stressed out and obviously anxious and everything else, if my boss said anything to me at all, that would have been a surprise. And if they'd said something, it would have been along the lines of, well, that's not my problem, sort yourself out and get on with the job. Now, we have learnt a lot since those days, and I'm going back a number of years. And as I said, I think over the last certainly decade, that there's been far more focus of attention, societally as well as within organizations, because we know the stats, don't we? We know that 1 in 5, 1 in 6 people will suffer from or do suffer from diagnosable and recognizable mental health challenges and symptoms. We've also talked a lot about other related areas like neurodiversity and the importance of creating environments which are inclusive to all and recognizing we're all on different spectrums as part of neurodiversity. And those are all parts of mental health as well, how we create inclusive and safe environments for everybody. I think during the pandemic, and certainly from the evidence that we've seen through the research we do through the CIPD, of course, the whole debate of mental health and indeed well-being itself really started to accelerate. The reality was, of course, the pandemic itself was a health crisis. And I remember, again, very sort of simple ideas, going back to the idea of what my boss might have said to me in the past. People were saying a lot during the pandemic. We would ask each other how we were. Now, normally when you ask somebody how you are, you expect the response, good, thank you, and you all move on. I think a lot of what was going on in the pandemic was people saying, no, how are you really? Or they'd ask it twice. And so we started, I think, to see an acceleration because of what was happening through the pandemic and many of these ideas. And then, of course, what we've been all working with and what a lot of today is about is saying, okay, so if we've raised the visibility and the importance of mental health and the importance of recognizing this is a duty of care that we have as employers, but it has direct business impacts as well. This is about managing stress in the workplace. It's managing people's emotional and mental health so that they can perform at their best. It's about our responsibility to create jobs and cultures which are supportive of people, as I've touched on, in every way. And we also know, of course, there are very direct impacts of poor mental health on output and productivity. The first impact often is a productivity impact. The second impact is then one of absence from work. And we know that one of the primary long-term causes of absence from work is stress and mental health. So we're now in a phase of time, of course, where things are getting tighter. Costs are tight, a lot of pressure on businesses. Already talking to a number of you this afternoon, you're saying, gosh, is everybody feeling a bit of a squeeze on these things? If costs are tight, does that mean that programs around things like well-being or programs around things like diversity and inclusion might be seen as, well, sort of a bit nice to have, but times are tough now, so we're going to have to push some of that out or reduce our funding? I think there is some of that goes on. It goes on through all of these economic cycles. So now is very much, therefore, about, so how do we make sure that we have the evidence? And it's the evidence, I think, from two very important perspectives. One is the evidence about what interventions make the biggest difference. What are the things that really drive people's sense of mental health and well-being within our organizations? And how do we understand those different interventions? Of course, Suzanne is going to talk particularly about mental health first aid, which has been one of the big initiatives, I guess, that many organizations have implemented. Now, the other part of the measurement, of course, is, and what difference is it making? What's the outcome that this creates? Which is back to the point I made about creating the business case for all of this and sustaining, therefore, the momentum of mental health within our organizations. But the other thing I would just add is that these are subjects which are important to our employees. Employees increasingly looking for organizations that they know are going to care about these things, all the way from the ideas of inclusive cultures, safe cultures, speak up cultures, and cultures and jobs and work that is good for my well-being, and that you understand that as an employer. And it's very linked, therefore, to the ideas of things like good work and how we design jobs for the future. So you've got employees asking for this much more. You've also got investors asking for it much more. We're doing a lot of work on the whole ESG thing and the S part in particular, and I'm a very strong advocate of the view that well-being should be one of those critical central measures as part of the S part of ESG. Because if you look at an organization and you believe, as I know we all do, that well-being is central to their mission and their sustainability and their ability to attract and retain the right people, etc., then it should be called out and should be measured consistently. So there's quite a number of initiatives now, and organizations like CCLA, one of the big asset managers, investment fund managers, are looking at organizations trying to pick up information about, so what are you actually doing on things like mental health? And what's your evidence? So this is back again to the core, I think, of a lot of what we're going to talk about today, which is, so where's the evidence? What works? How do we understand that? How do we evidence it? What difference does it make to the business? And then how do we start to be more transparent and really promote these things as fundamental to business strategy and fundamental to the ideas of businesses and their duty of care and building not only healthy workforces, but ultimately healthy societies as well. That's a big agenda, right? Those are things that we all want to really get behind, I think, and drive forwards. So as Carrie said, I mean, today is a good sort of mixed format, and thanks to Lena and all the team. So we've got a number of case studies from people, many of whom will be familiar to you. So a number of different videos that we're going to show people talking about what are they doing within their organizations. And then we have a rather wonderful panel, which Charles is going to chair. That, I think, will give us a lot of opportunity for a bit of discourse and dialogue between all of us, and I know we'll all want to encourage that. And I should, forgive me, I should also, of course, welcome the people who are online. I always forget to look at cameras, but hello, everybody who's online, and welcome very much to this. We will also be able to pick up questions from you on I guess it's the chat or whatever it's coming through, and we will be able to feed those through as well. So engage in that way when you're online as well. So without further ado, should we start to look at a couple of these case studies? So I think the first two we have, one is from Andy Rhodes, who will be familiar to you. He was Chief Constable of Lancashire for many years. He was also one of the key leads of what was known as Oscar Kilo, OK, which is the big wellbeing initiative across the police. And the blue light services, as we know, and indeed across healthcare and social care in general, the intense pressure that they face, understanding well-being, particularly mental health, absolutely paramount to their ability to be successful and sustainable as organizations. So I think it's a good place to start by listening to Andy. And then we'll have Bruce, who's in the room, from BT. So Bruce can come up and wave and run around as well if you want, alongside your video. But let's, if we tee up the first.
Well, Oscar Kilo, the National Police Wellbeing Service, sits at the heart of policing. So it's a system of 200,000 workers across 43 different police forces. So our approach was determined by the fact that we needed scale, affordability, a really strong evidence base. So we did a international literature review led by Dr. Ian Hesketh, where we cast the net across law enforcement partners and elsewhere to find out where the best practice at that time was. This was about 6 years ago, because for us, peer support was obviously starting to become a really important part of the psychological safe environment that we want to build and create for forces. We identified an organisation in Canada, actually, called Badge of Life Canada. We invited them over, we brought them over and funded it, and they trained our trainers and allowed us to adapt and tune in their model of peer support for our culture, for our environment, also with a view to how we could scale this up, and maintain the quality of it. And since then, we've had real success with it. We've trained thousands of people in police forces across the country, at every level, actually, from Chief Constable down to front line. So we've actually created our own training capability to deliver this training program. We offer it free to forces. But obviously, we put a lot of support in around those people who are trained as well. We established that peer support was one of the foundational things that would have a strong evidence base. Peers are such a powerful asset to an organisation. We trust our peers, right? You know what I mean? People will have conversations with peers about things that they won't with the line manager, etc. And we know that the other thing is there are a huge amount of people in organisations already doing this without being recognised for it. It's called the curse of the empath. It's, people in the workplace who have these natural skills, who are approachable, are already and have been for decades the go-to people when someone needs to talk to somebody about problems they're having. What we've done is, through peer support, we believe, formalise that, recognise it, make it safe.
I think immediately a number of really important messages. So it's still going. Straight on to Bruce.
Yeah, so the impact for us is that we collect data on numbers of interactions. Obviously, those interactions are confidential. We have numbers of people who are trained, and we have a lot of qualitative feedback from those networks as well. And the impact that we can see from this is increased feelings of organisational support, more likely to access occupational health services early rather than later. So the peer supporters are not therapists, they are approachable and well-informed people. And it's very important that one of the assets you get with a peer is they know exactly what that organisation has to offer, charities, other things like the NHS pathways, etc. they need to be a goldmine of information for the individual so that they can hold that conversation and potentially signpost and refer people on to the correct services. Think about safe practice. Look at the selection of people. Quite often people will volunteer for peer supporters because they're working through their own issues or recovering from their own issues and challenges around mental health, which can be a real positive. But sometimes for that individual, it can be something that can add additional pressure to them. Make sure the right support's in and risk management. So we should be looking at this as they are not therapists, but we should have the same level of supervisory support in above people who do this. So the boundaries are clear. They've got somebody to go to if they need help themselves. And also, it's not about numbers. Sometimes less is more. Good quality that you can support are far better than having too many people. We've found that out to our, to our disadvantage in the past. And, I think make sure that they don't get used for lots of other things by the organisation, because they're there for one thing and the organisation needs to understand what their role is as well. Otherwise, people will use them for things sometimes that they shouldn't be used for, and go over those boundaries.
So already some really good insights there. As I said, I mean, the top-down approach, and then recognizing this whole peer support mechanism, but already calling out ideas that I like the point you made about less is more, and then who are these peers? And so often people who put themselves forward as peers, as Andy touched on, be those people who've experienced mental health challenges. Rightly said, sometimes that's a positive, but equally we have to understand how we need to protect those people as well. By absorbing other people's problems as well, it can exacerbate some of their own. But again, it's so good to hear the commitment from such an important service, whereas mental health, we know, we can see it in the media, all these other things, PTSD, other things that happen because of what police forces experience. And the commitment that Andy has shown as a leader across the whole of the police force. So he's now no longer chief constable, but he continues to run and coordinate Oscar Kilo program. And then he talked a bit about some of the data that they're collecting on the different interactions, how different services are being used. So already, I think, some really good insights there. So let's hear from Bruce, BT, in the next case study.
Well, we've approached it by establishing a network within our networks. So we have a number of networks: Armed Forces Network, Gender Equality Network, and we actually have the peer-to-peer network. And so that enabled it to grow from predominantly in the UK to now it's a global network. We established the peer-to-peer support network first as a pilot. Having successfully launched the pilot, we then rolled it out by promoting it as a network within BT that any employee could join. And then within that network, we've created a group that are actually trained to provide what I would call mental health first aid. And they have to go through a number of internal trainings and vetting processes to ensure that they're meeting our caliber and capability for what we want to offer. We've got 923 people in the network, and of that, 300 are currently trained volunteers. We've got 100 on our wait list to go through workshops, and the rest are allies. They're people that are supporting the network. There have been several different types of impact. First of all, we know for a fact that a lot of people that are drawn to the network have had either had or supported people with mental health issues before. So they now have a community of support for themselves. They've also been used by a lot of people that just didn't want to go to our clinical services. They wanted to reach out to colleagues. So that's been what I would describe as a slow burn, but we're seeing more and more people choosing to go, and also the organisation choosing now to promote this network as a place where people could go for support. And then one of the benefits that we hadn't really anticipated, but has really helped, is that we've got a community of people promoting all the wellbeing support resources and initiatives we've got in BT that go far broader than just mental health. I think there were several things that I would say to any employer undertaking this activity. First of all, I would start off small and grow. I would ensure that the people that are providing the service or the network get a lot of support, and that they know where to go when they run into difficulties, because otherwise they can feel a little bit lonely in that role. One of the things that we've had to do is adapt some of the training and a little bit of the support when we're working outside of the UK. What we realised was that there are legalities and cultural differences in how mental health's perceived and dealt with, particularly in Asia, but also in the Americas. And so we've had to adapt, still keeping the core principles, but we need to be a little bit flexible when we're applying this approach outside of the UK.
So thanks, Bruce, who sat there in the middle row, enjoying watching himself on video like we all do. Obviously, it looked like you were in somewhere out in the desert, or improving your mental health and well-being by doing that. But anyway, some great insights there, Bruce, which I think reflected some of the points that Andy made as well. So things like start small and grow. Don't just try and go at this as like a sort of mass attack, and learn through others and by doing. I really liked also how you linked the peer network to other networks, which I guess include diversity networks and so on. And so you start to see it's part of this wider agenda of inclusion, safe cultures, and all these other ideas, which I think is really good. And I also like your point towards the end there, which is a very interesting observation about cultural adaptation. Sometimes when you think about different countries and the ways that they think about these things,
quite a lot of things. This yellow line with the exclamation mark, it means unconfirmed. As you can see, quite a lot of confirmed. So if I want to confirm one of those, click onto that.
Next
it says
up
review.
is Susanna. So we've got a couple more videos after Susanna, but Susanna is here. So Susanna Robson-Hart has done, I think it's part of a doctoral research, isn't it, on initiatives like mental health first aid. The evidence to how it works, what are some of the challenges, what are some of the benefits, and so forth. So with no further ado, I'm very pleased to welcome Susanna to the stage.
Thanks, Peter, and great to be here today. So yeah, I'm going to talk about the evidence around mental health first aid specifically. So obviously other peer support initiatives do exist, but my research has been around MHFA, so that's the focus of today. So I think the first thing to say is that the workplace research on mental health first aid is very, very limited. So I'm going to talk about that, but I'm actually going to start by looking at the broader context. There are some useful insights that we can take from that, and that's where there is actually more research. So contexts such as the general population, schools, colleges, universities, the armed forces, young people. So there's lots of different ways in which MHFA has been used. So I'm going to look at that broader context first, and then kind of come specifically to the workplace research. So to give a bit of context about the populations that have been studied, so the kind of the who and the what in terms of the evidence. So there are three main groups of individuals who have been studied in the literature. I think going from left to right, there's more research with those on the left and less with those on the right. So the first group is mental health first aiders, as they're sometimes referred to as, or trainees who have been through the mental health first aid programme. So there's a body of evidence that looks at the impact on mental health first aiders in terms of a number of different areas, which I'll come on to. The second population is groups with access to MHFA support. So people who have got a mental health first aider in close proximity, whether that's in their school, their workplace, their sports team, whatever it might be. And the third group is recipients of mental health first aid support. So those who have actually received help from a mental health first aider, they're sometimes referred to as the end user or the recipients of support. And what's quite confusing when I first started looking at the literature is that actually a number of studies talk about the fact that they've got data around recipients of mental health first aid, but when you actually drill down into it, what they've really got is data from that middle group, so groups with access to mental health first aid. So there's a real lack of evidence and data from recipients of mental health first aid support. So in terms of the outcomes that are measured then in the literature relating to those three different populations, this is a sliding scale or a kind of inverted pyramid in terms of the amount of research and data that exists on these different outcomes. In relation to reactions to the training, so how did trainees find the training course? Has their mental health related knowledge improved as a result of the training course? Have their confidence and intentions to provide support to somebody with a mental health condition, has that improved? And behavioural change is also looked at in a number of studies in terms of the actual support that mental health first aiders or trainees go on to provide after their training. There's also then a few studies, and they're very few and far between, that have mental health related outcomes for recipients or potential recipients. So is there a positive impact in terms of the mental health? Also looks at kind of help seeking behaviour around mental health as well. So it's not just mental health as a measure or mental wellbeing. And there's also an arm of research looking at mental health outcomes in mental health first aiders. I think this is interesting because there tends to be two views around this. One is that actually MHFA is a great training programme to go on for mental health first aiders to improve their own mental health and wellbeing through the content of the training, and then also potentially through the positive kind of experience that they have being a mental health first aider. There's another view that actually you're putting people in harm's way, you're exposing them to other people's distress. It's potentially a stressful role to be in, and it could actually have a negative effect on the mental health of mental health first aiders. And I'll talk about what the findings are in relation to that. Obviously, we want to know from an organisational perspective, when we're talking about the workplace, what impact does MHFA have on organisational outcomes around absence, presenteeism, productivity, even things like job satisfaction, organisational commitments be of interest too. So those are the areas that are focused on within the literature. So I'm still at the kind of broad, looking at the broad perspective at this point across different contexts. So there are three key meta-analyses. So meta-analyses are studies that bring together the findings from lots of different studies that have addressed same or similar research questions. So a really good way of getting a good summary of a topic. And they'll tend to, or they will have certain criteria for inclusion in a meta-analysis. So there's a level of robustness. So the three studies from 2014, 2018 and 2019, and the second two focused on controlled trials only. So these are methodologically stronger in that they had a comparison group. So they were looking at people that have been through the MHFA training and the outcomes compared to people that haven't been through that training or have perhaps done another type of programme. And this is a really top-level summary of what those meta-analyses found, pretty similar findings across the board. So there was fairly good evidence that MHFA training improved the mental health literacy of trainees. So those who went through the training, there was generally a significant impact on their mental health-related knowledge, attitudes, confidence to help someone with a mental health issue, and intentions to help someone, so pretty confident around that. There was a small and more questionable impact on helping behaviours. So in terms of behaviour change, there was some evidence that people actually helped more people following their MHFA training, but it was small and particularly questionable after 6 months. The studies didn't find any impact on potential recipients' mental health. So these are the groups that have got access to a mental health first aider. Very small number of studies, so not a lot to go on, but the findings didn't report a positive outcome there. Same with mental health first aider or trainee mental health. The findings didn't conclude that there was a positive or negative impact on mental health first aiders. So back to the point I raised earlier around those sort of two different views of mental health first aiders, that actually going through this training, becoming a peer supporter could be beneficial to their mental health, or the other view that actually it could be detrimental. The small amount of research that there is to date is neutral on that. You know, there isn't data to kind of support one view or the other, which is quite interesting. And these studies didn't have any data on actual recipients, so on actual people who have received MHFA support, so really lacking. And it's obviously very difficult to study recipients of mental health first aid support for a number of reasons. You know, the confidential nature of the intervention, the fact you don't know when you're going to need it, you don't know when it's coming. So studies that aim to gather that data from people who have actually received support need to have really, really large samples, because we work on the basis that a quarter of any group are going to have mental health problems, and then a certain number of those people will potentially seek mental health first aid support. So your numbers are kind of whittling down and down. So if you want to be able to get data on people that have received support, you've got to start with a really large kind of population from the outset to get enough data points to look at people before and after a mental health first aid intervention. So it's a really challenging area to do good research in. Moving on to the workplace specific studies then. So the HSE did a great report in 2018, and 5 years on, I would still always refer back to this as the best reference in terms of a summary of the workplace evidence. So they looked at all of the evidence from work-related studies. They had certain inclusion criteria to make sure that they were all robust studies, and very similar to what was found in the general context. They found some evidence that MHFA training raises the awareness of trainees, so people that have gone on the programme more aware of mental ill health, including the signs and symptoms. But moving backwards through those three sort of traffic light points, they found limited evidence that MHFA actually led to behaviour change in terms of the trainees actually going out there and helping people following their training. And there was no evidence that MHFA training had improved organisational management of mental health in the workplace. And the reason for the lack of evidence is because the research isn't there. So it's not a case of there's lots of evidence that sort of says it's not effective. It's the absence of evidence and research that's the problem. That's saying I always get it the wrong way around, but the absence of evidence is obviously not the same as the evidence of absence. So that's what the issue is here. The second workplace-specific study to mention, I think we might hear more about this later, is the IOSH Mentor study. And this study concluded that MHFA was one possible intervention that did seem to be helpful for raising awareness of mental health issues in the workplace. But obviously there are lots of other training programmes, interventions that can achieve that aim. From the surveys and interviews that they carried out, they raised a number of concerns about the use of MHFA in the workplace, some of which we've heard about in the case studies around boundaries of the MHFA role, and obviously the lack of supporting evidence, which keeps coming through. And that study really called for more workplace-specific studies, and we're kind of still waiting on those to come through. There is a study that's in progress at the moment at London South Bank University. So the bottom one on here, the Empower study. And this is unique because it's going to be looking at the end user. So they really wanted to try and plug that gap in terms of the evidence and focus on the end users of workplace mental health first aid. And it's a randomised controlled trial, so it's robust in that sense. There have, I know, been delays due to COVID and also real challenges around getting sufficient data from the end users. So again, just reinforcing that point of how difficult it is to collect data in this area to understand, you know, the real sort of end impacts of mental health first aid. A couple of other individual studies to mention if you are interested in the literature. The first one was a big study that was done in UK secondary schools, so a workplace in the sense that it was looking at teachers. It was a multi-component intervention, so it wasn't just MHFA. There were other interventions that were in place as well. It was a 2-year longitudinal study, so they gave people the MHFA training, followed up 1 year later and then 2 years later. And they found that there was no impact on the key outcomes that they were looking at, which were teacher well-being and mental health, teacher depression, teacher absence levels, and I think possibly presenteeism as well. And there's also no impact on the student data that they collected. So they collected student mental health and attainment data as well. But again, the key thing to point out, or one of the key things to point out there, is that they didn't have any data on end users. So it was very much about people with access to data. And then just quickly to mention my own research, which looked at MHFA in one organisation, and I did manage to get some data from end users or recipients of MHFA qualitatively through interviews, and did find some positive outcomes in terms of self-reported mental health, self-reported work-related outcomes. But obviously that's one small scale study, and we need kind of replications of those sorts of studies. And there was little impact on the mental health first aider outcomes beyond positive findings around increased knowledge, mental health literacy, etc., as was expected, but there wasn't an impact on mental health in either direction of the mental health trainees. So what do we actually know then? Very, very little when you really break down the evidence. So we know that MHFA is effective in improving mental health literacy in those that are trained, and it increases the confidence of providing help to someone with a mental health problem, which is obviously a great starting point in terms of creating a culture in your organisation which is supportive and has people that are skilled and equipped to have those conversations. But there's a huge sort of black hole in terms of all the things that we don't know about. In addition to the fact that we don't really know much about the impact on end users, we also don't know much about the implementation of MHFA in workplaces. So is there a difference in different cultures, in different contexts, in different industries, in different types of organisations? Are the differences depending on who you train and how you implement it and how you use the intervention? So all of those questions are very much remain unanswered in the research base. And this is not a unique issue. It's very difficult in lots of situations to effectively evaluate workplace mental health interventions. So it's not something that's unique to MHFA, although you've got the added difficulty of trying to get data from the people who have actually been supported. So just to finish up then, how can this evidence inform employers in terms of moving forward? Some of this has already started to be discussed in the case studies, and I'm sure will be explored in much more detail in the panel discussion. But for me, given the lack of evidence around the workplace, and yes, there are more studies coming through, but it's going to be a slow burn in terms of that research actually coming to fruition. My advice is very much to take a cautious and considered approach, given that there are so many unknowns in terms of the impact. Ensuring that any peer support initiative, MHFA or otherwise, is part of a wider strategy is, you know, the starting point in terms of taking that considered approach, and having in place some really good governance to mitigate some of those potential risks. And I guess it's about assuming that all of the things that are unknown in terms of the research could be risks. So it's worthwhile putting in place processes and systems to try and mitigate those as far as possible. around, recruitment, who you are bringing into the peer supporter roles, making sure that they've got a really good idea of what they're coming into, what it's going to mean for them and their role. Clarifying the role remit within your organisation so that you can have those really clear boundaries. How a peer supporter is going to be managed and supported, systems and processes and people that are responsible for that management and support of peer supporters. And this is not exhaustive by any means, but also data and monitoring. So how are you going to collect your own data within your own organisation to try and get a sense of how the initiative is working, both for the people that are being supported, whether there's any opportunities to collect anonymous data in that respect, and for the mental health first aiders themselves in terms of how they're doing in the role, any issues that they're coming up against, any difficulties around boundaries, etc. And lastly, would recommend keeping up to date with any new workplace research that does come through. Obviously, there's not much in the pipeline, unfortunately, but it's such a popular topic. Employers very interested in this area. So hopefully, as new research does come through, it'll be prominent and accessible to employers to enable you to make informed decisions about whether and how to implement MHFA or other peers. References there if anyone wants them, can share those through the questions later on, but if anyone wants to connect after the event, then LinkedIn is, we can do them now. Okay, we can do questions now. So yeah, any burning questions?
Yeah, so we have got a little bit of time for a couple of questions. I think it's some really interesting. I mean, your overall observation of absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence absence, but it's sort of striking that none of them are showing big outcomes so far. I'd really liked, and I'd said it's a point I always emphasize too, that if you see this as part of a wider strategy, if you think this is somehow the solution, do this on its own, probably not going to make the difference. It's part of a wider strategy. But in any event, I mean, let's throw it open to you. Any sort of questions or observations from your own experience of implementing programs at MHA? Yeah.
Really enjoyed your presentation, Susanna. What I'd really like to know are your thoughts on how governance can be obtained when using work.
I mean, I think probably one of the main things is having a dedicated person that looks after your peer support network, because it can, depending on the size and structure of your organisation, but it can be a full-time job in terms of looking at the training that you're bringing in, how you're going to recruit people, and the management and support of that network. So I think don't underestimate the work that's required to support that network, especially if it's a big network. In the case study, we heard about them having 900 and something members. That's a huge undertaking in terms of making sure that all those people are working within the boundaries, working to the role remit that you've set within the organisation, getting their refresher training, their ongoing CPD, escalations of any issues from their side. So I think having that kind of dedicated person and systems and processes, having clarity around all of those areas so that you've got a recruitment process. It's not, we advertise MHFA training and anyone can sign up and that's that. There's a process of making sure people can really give informed consent to going into that role. Tech solutions to kind of manage the network. So maybe people are all accessed via an app or a website or something. Lots more things as well, but those.
Actually, just quickly on that, and Bruce, have anything to add to that from the governance perspective, how you made it work in BT? Oh, sorry, yeah, we need to pass the mic up to. Yeah, and then I'm going to come to a couple of online questions as well.
Okay. One of the things that we did as part of ensuring we got the right people was that the vetting. So we insisted on line manager agreement. We also insisted on a third-party reference that could be within the organisation or outside. When they went through the training, the trainers were keeping an eye on them. an anecdote. We screened out someone after he asked in the classroom, how do you fake empathy? Yeah, so you can see why we need to do that. Then they do an induction where we lay out the protocols, and then they also sign a charter, which of course is a voluntary agreement. But by and large, occasionally we've had a problem, but they seem to be surfaced reasonably quickly, and that seems to have worked very well. So the protocols up front make the big difference, and then everything that was being said about the maintenance, the induction, the CPD, the ongoing training, and then they've got a group, they work together. So those things, that's all I'd add.
So Jim's going to pick up. So for the online audience, as I said at the beginning, do keep feeding your questions in. But Jim, I think you've got a couple from our online audience.
Yes, thanks, Peter. Yes, a couple of questions for you, Susanna. The first was, why do you think that so many companies have invested in mental health first aid if the evidence is mixed, stroke minimal? And just perhaps the second question. No. And the second one was, would it be helpful to have further research on wellbeing champions networks? It seems it's very difficult in this area too, but wellbeing champions are common within organisations.
So the first question, if I was very cynical, I would say because Mental Health First Aid England have a very good marketing team, and they've done a lot of promotion of the initiative, and I think there's been a real a bit of a sort of contagion effect of employers seeing that someone else is using it, so well, if they're using it, then we need to be using it, and it's kind of just escalated really quickly without that, much quicker than sort of other mental health interventions, without that checking back to the evidence. I think a lot of employers are aware of the evidence base, and sometimes when people talk about MHFA being evidence-based, yes, the content is evidence-based, the content of the training in terms of how you work with different mental health conditions, and yes, there's the evidence around it increasing trainees' knowledge and mental health literacy, and perhaps for some organisations that's been sort of to put it on their agenda. And there's possibly an element of it being quite quick or perceived as a quick win as well. You know, it's a programme that's pre-packaged, it's ready-made, it's on the face of it, although it's not in reality on the face of it, it seems relatively easy to introduce as an off-the-shelf product. Lots of reasons, and employers, wanting to do the right thing around mental health and have support systems in place, and sometimes kind of grabbing at things without looking, and that applies to other.
I would just quickly,
it
was about wellbeing champions, but I think the marketing point is a really good one. I mean, even calling it mental health first aid, we're all quite familiar with first aiders at work. So mental health first aid, well, I know how to do that. And part of the problem is because physical first aid is a very different thing. Mental health support, mental health wellbeing. But yeah, the second question was about wellbeing champions.
Yeah. And I think in some organisations, mental health first aiders are actually used as wellbeing champions, so it's all about the remit, what you're looking for in your organisation. But MHFA has been focused on and kind of has received a lot of scrutiny. So we're kind of questioning the evidence and everything behind it. But the same goes for all those sort of mental health champion interventions as well. There's probably even less research around those. But I think that the whole piece really needs looking at in terms, particularly the impact on the end users and how it affects organisational.
And we talked about this issue a bit in the national forum. So the NHS, for example, promoting the idea of wellbeing ambassadors, sponsors, champions. I mean, it's another way, I guess, of getting some organisational commitment behind these things. But I certainly echo what you say, Susanna, the evidence behind those sorts of things, not all that clear. But I think they're all part and parcel of ways of thinking about more holistic strategy. But yes.
And there are lots of training programmes that don't have evidence.
Indeed, that is certainly true as well. Yeah, Judith.
Just one question around, I think in my experience seeing mental health first aid used as a way for line managers to get out of having difficult conversations. Sometimes actually they can send someone else, they can send them to someone else, but actually it's the line manager that needs to be having that discussion. I don't know if in your research you looked at how line managers sort of play into that, into the research on mental health first aid?
Yeah, so in my own research, I actually looked specifically at the difference in outcomes between managers and non-managers who trained as mental health first aiders, and I'm having to try and remember exactly what the findings were now. But there were significant differences on a couple of areas. I don't think there was a difference on mental well-being. I think there was something around role conflict, and perhaps managers finding it more difficult to be in a manager role and a mental health first aid role and balance the duality of that role. So there were definitely differences, and that was one of the recommendations, actually, thesis, that we need to understand the difference between. Some organisations have chosen to use MHFA for that as a manager's training programme, not a replacement for good management behaviours and getting managers to be able to recognise and address psychosocial hazards in the workplace. That preventative. Definitely have questions about people using not having those.
Because the reality is that the manager is usually the first line of contact,
Yeah.
and training managers to recognise the signs of stress and other things. And what Bruce has said in introductory remarks, demonstrating that empathy, at least asking the questions. They may not have all the answers, but that is the first line of interaction.
I guess it's, well, what is their role? Is it their role as a manager, and that's being supported by some of the skills that they've got from MHFA, or are they acting as a mental health aid? I think those two things that need any approach.
The other point I make is line managers are often source the stress in the first place. So let's not forget that either. Yes. So go, yeah.
Hi there, Richard Caddis from BT. In your research, did you see the effectiveness or otherwise of where the programme sat? By that, if it sat in reward, if it sat with health and safety, if it sat with occupational health? Was there anything, even just from an observational basis, that you saw it was more, stronger embedded, more trusted, seen with suspicion?
So in my own research, it was just in one organisation, so there wasn't anything in that respect. And in terms of reviewing the literature more broadly, it really doesn't go into that level of detail. So I think that's the great idea for future research in terms of understanding where it sits. And I think that's alongside those other questions around implementation, and it works better if we do it like this or like that, if it's owned, or if it's owned collaboratively. Potential definitely isn't.
We've got time for one more question up at the back. Maybe take the two questions very quickly.
Jacob from Salt and Light Financial Services. We run kind of free financial wellbeing and coaching workshops for corporates and businesses, and we've done that for a while. And what we've found is that a lot of employees are stressed out with their finances, and we also offer an advice side to the business. So we offer a coaching and advice side. I didn't know if there was any kind of bits of your research where you've seen actually finances are a bigger spike, or is it divorce, or is it I'd just be interested from a personal perspective just to understand how that worked when we're talking to businesses about implementing coaching and workshop around finances.
We'll just quickly take the second question.
Very much. I think points were brought up, and I was very interested. When COVID happened, we increased the mental illness because people have become more authentic. So then we have nation. So if you don't statement. I do understand about well, when it's different. Medical students trained how to then that matters, and I think that's what. Thank you very much.
First point about, organisations need tailored solutions. So that would absolutely be my bottom line message about mental health first aid. It's not either you don't use it, it's consider whether it the needs to have at this point in time. Are you able to implement it in a safe way? And so then you might find that it's being cautious of the kind of lack of evidence. Just quickly on the point about financial stress, not from my own research, but I know that we're definitely seeing that as a key driver of mental health issues in organisations. So I think it's definitely gone up the ranks in terms of the things that people are being stressed with, contributing to poor mental health, absolutely.
And I think that will come through more sort of financial awareness training, things like that. I wouldn't put that in the bracket of what a mental health first aider might do, because they're not typically trained financial consultants, are they? But it is an interesting dimension, and that's part of what, of course, we're all seeing, is that there are many different drivers of mental health and well-being, which we need to understand, including what you said about the sort of bringing my whole self to work and what that really means, and all the sort of empathetic cultures that we talk about, safe cultures, they're all part of this, which is why I think the point you made also in your closing remarks, Susanna, was about think about this as part of an integral and holistic strategy. But anyway, thank you so much, Susanna. So again, thank you very much. The next, we're running a few minutes behind, but it's important to have that kind of conversation built on some of what Susanna's research was showing. So we've got a couple more videos coming up. So the first is from Carl Simons from Filed Counsel. So we've already heard from BT, and I also want to acknowledge Dr. Paul Litchfield in the audience, because BT, I think, has been one of the lead companies on this. And Paul, of course, was, I think, their wellbeing champion right from the get-go in terms of when BT first started to talk about these things. So it's always good to see Paul. But anyway, Filed Counsel. So this is an interesting example of a very different kind of organisation. And Carl Simons. So should we play the BT?
The approach we took towards ensuring peer support around mental health was, first of all, to build it into our strategy. So we had a strategy called Time to Talk, where mental health was included within that to make sure that we embraced those who across the entire organisation. It's very important from a leadership perspective that strategy actually has within it a suite of what we call health performance indicators. So we were articulating to the board and to the executive team and through the quarterly risk committee meetings that mental health was discussed at those. So that ensured that right from the top we were articulating the right messages. One of the things we looked at was competency upskilling to make sure we had appropriate peer support. We split this into two parts, a half-day mental health awareness course for all employees and a 2-day mental health first aid course, which would go through to ensure we had a 1 in 10 ratio. So we wanted mental health first aiders built within each of the teams across the organisation. That worked extremely well. We included virtual reality filming within that to really bring a different flavour and bring to life a series of episodes that everybody would be immersed in to make sure the conversation was a lot richer and a lot deeper. For every 1 physical first aid intervention I had 5 times as many mental health first aid intervention. So we were averaging a ratio, even in the first year of releasing mental health first aiders, the pathways they provided towards help and support, we'll speak about in a second, but we had 5 to 1 ratio, 5 times as many people coming forward with expressions of concerns around their mental health being poor at that moment, and therefore requesting and seeking help, guidance and support. That was extremely powerful. We also brought, as part of the Thriving at Work campaign, the impact of that was shared with the Cabinet Office representatives from the government, and government were listening to us in terms of the outcomes that the mental health first aid community were actually providing a pathway to help and support. It's very important you have a framework around the mental health first aiders. They're not trained psychologists. They're doing a course like a physical first aider where they're able to, at that moment, be a point of contact and a gateway to provide extra professional support via the pathway that they provide to professionals who can get help and support to the individuals that need it. So my advice in terms of to any other organization looking at this is please don't sit silent. Regardless of where you are on this journey, reach out, get advice and support, because there's lots of it available. I think the mental health first aid support that we provided across the company as the gateway and pathway towards getting professional help for individuals suffering or struggling at that moment was very powerful. So I would advocate definitely the use of mental health first aiders within organisations based on my experience.
I think that he was actually talking in the context of Thames Water there on the podcast. But again, some interesting points. Health performance indicators, quarterly reviews. Again, we've touched on this subject already. What are the things we're measuring? How do we evidence those? And using those evidence points to keep promoting and keep the sustained investment in these areas. The wider awareness, I'm very interested to, I think I've heard Carl talk about it before, but virtual reality type training. Because a lot of these things we're sort of learning about case studies, stories, storytelling, narrative, and I assume that's part of what he was driving at with things like VR. And then, of course, emphasizing the backup support. If you have mental health first aiders in the peer network, that is not the end stop. And so much of actually what they do will be, where they need to, is to point to other support. And that leads us into occupational health. It also leads us into support more broadly outside organizations, into the wider mental health support community, which we know still needs quite a lot of investment. The next final one is from Ruth Pott. So she's from a big construction company, BAM Nuttall. So again, a very important sector, which we know as a sector has suffered a lot from mental health issues, suicide issues, all sorts of things. And Judith's nodding because she came from that sector too. So it'd be very interesting to hear Ruth's take on this. So should we play her video?
Yeah, really great question. We started this sort of 6 years ago and just inviting people to come forward to be trained as mental health first aiders, thinking we'd have a few. We ended up with more than 400 quite quickly. So we share widely the number of people that we've got trained, make sure the business knows who's trained in terms of mental health first aid, support them with extensive training, refresher training, particularly and more recently suicide awareness training. We get our leaders to be trained. So some of our leaders have done the mental health first aid training as well. Those who haven't been trained in MHFA, we have had some master classes and we're doing that again later this year for our most senior leadership team, so that they have at least the basic mental health first aid knowledge, mental health knowledge, so they understand what we're striving to achieve in the business, and they can support other senior people in the business, which I think is really important. We have specialist mental health first aiders, so we have networks that people, if they want to talk about a particular issue, for example, we're in a very male orientated business, so if we've got somebody who wants to talk to somebody who's been through the prostate cancer journey, they can easily find somebody to do that. We have created wellbeing rooms so that people can have, it's just creating a safe environment to have those kind of conversations. We have our mental health first aiders, they have an app to use so they can record the number of conversations they have with people. We remind them of boundaries. We have a wellbeing champions. We call our mental health first aiders are wellbeing champions. We have a regular conference for them, share resources and best practice. And the mental health first aiders that we have, we pay them an allowance, so they get sort of financial reward for the huge commitment and dedication and time that they put into doing this. we offer all of our employees wellbeing days and a volunteering day. So again, it's just indicating to them that there's huge mental health and wellbeing support available to them. The impact has been awesome and immense. It has been incredibly well received the whole time that we've been promoting mental health and wellbeing. It has been really warmly welcomed. Everybody has engaged with it. We really haven't had any resistance to it. From a leadership perspective, our leaders really get it, and they have fully engaged with all the conversations, all the training, all the programs that we've put in place. We know last year that just a sample of the wellbeing champions that we have, so our mental health first aiders, we did a survey of 75 of them last year, and they indicated between them they had supported something in the order of 1,300 employees. So again, a huge number of our employees being supported by the mental health first aiders. And we know from all the surveys that we do, whether it's culture surveys, engagement surveys, ED&I surveys, or wellbeing surveys, that our wellbeing proposition and support is hugely appreciated. And we get that through Investors in People and Mind surveys in particular that we do. We also have a Levers survey that also indicates that people really do feel supported, that their managers, they feel supported by their managers. And it's been so well received. We now have a direct link between, obviously, in a civil engineering construction company, safety is critical. It is at the forefront of all the work that we do, but we now make the links with well-being so that people understand poor mental health or well-being. If you've got stuff going on at home that you're concerned about or worried about, you're worried about somebody, you're not going to be focusing wholly on safety if you're in that kind of role. So it's what can we do to support you so that you can really concentrate on your job and reduce the likelihood of an incident or an accident or a poor decision or poor judgment being exercised, and all the possible consequences of that.
Yeah, some really good points, and a very strong commitment within a very important sector, as I touched on. I think this idea of specialist support, focusing, as we touched on the previous question, that what are some of the reasons why people are suffering from poor mental health? The bereavement, Ruth talked about, for example, people accessing networks of support around cancer, long-term illness, things of that nature, or going back to the financial wellbeing point. So I think there's some really good thoughts there about how you begin to focus it and say, okay, so let's try to pull out some of the particular areas which we know are prevalent in how they impact people's mental health. Obviously, very much again stress the leadership engagement and support, and also all these other surveys which are showing, and I touched on in my opening remarks, that we know now that employers are far more interested in things like, okay, how am I going to get supported by my line manager? Is your organization serious about well-being? So on. So some very good case studies. We've got two more after the panel, but now's the time to move on to the panel. I'd like to invite Charles up to the stage. Charles is going to lead the panel, and we'll certainly have, I know, time for interaction with the panel before we move towards the close around 4 o'clock. So, Charles.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, where's it? Oh, there it is. I think we're all here. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Charles Alberts from Clifford Chance, and it's my absolute pleasure to host this panel today. This has been many months in the making, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. All going to plan, there should be an opportunity for questions and answers at the end. So if you're joining us online, please just submit your questions as before on the Q&A, and then we'll select some at the end. To kick us off, could I ask each of the panelists, probably just kind of from my side, to just introduce yourself, your role, and if relevant, your particular interest in healthcare support. Please do.
Okay, so hi everyone, I'm Stephanie Fitzgerald. I'm founder of a health wellbeing consultancy called SOYO, and I was previously with Rolls-Royce, and I was responsible for developing and delivering their mental health champion network, which was across 50,000 employees at the time. And obviously it's a big global corporation. So I'm very interested in mental health champion networks being globally applicable and making sure that they're not UK centric. because I find that can be a big, so that's my specialist area of interest.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alistair Woodland. I'm a partner in the employment team here at Chance, and I have a sort of quite wide-ranging practice, but that involves advising clients and actually the firm itself on issues to do with discrimination, disability issues, related issues.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Duncan Spencer. I'm head of advice and practice at the Institution of Occupational Safety and Health, IOSH. I'm afraid I was missed off the list somewhere. If you're looking for my name, I'm not there.
Sorry.
But I am here anyway, and I do have things to say, obviously. So we are the largest membership body for occupational health and safety practitioners in the world. We're a global organisation, and part of my team actually commissions a research programme, which includes, of course, the Mentor study that Susanna was talking about earlier. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what was in that study.
Afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Ord. In my day job, I work for Lloyds Banking Group as a continuous improvement director, so fixing a lot of our broken processes, and banks have lots of them, so that's my day job. And then what I also do is I lead our LGBTQ network's mental health agenda. So I'm going to be talking to you specifically about what Lloyds has done in that space.
Hi there, everyone. I'm Aaron. I'm an occupational health physician and medical director at Health Partners. So I work closely with a number of firms, predominantly at the moment city-based. So I have a lot of experience of working in the mental health arena. As you can imagine, a lot of occupational health at the moment, probably 60–70% of referrals are all health related. So it is something which I'm very interested in and have lots of opinions on, just in terms of particular mental health first aiders and support, governance and safeguarding as well.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone, and welcome to the panel. My first questions for Alistair, not because we're colleagues, but because I thought let's deal with some of the heavy stuff first and end a little bit lighter. When we had our discussion before, today, we were exploring the kind of some of the legal considerations, and what I initially had in my mind as perhaps one or two things quickly kind of expanded into, oh, well, you've got to think of this and that, and what if that scenario happens, and so on. Could you just share some of your insights from a legal perspective in terms of employers providing mental health peer support, whether that be first aid or anything else? Just some of the things that we should be bearing in mind as we more consciously design our programs.
Yeah. So I thought maybe it was worth just giving a little, before drilling into mental health sort of first aiders specifically, just thinking about an employer's obligations more generally in respect of mental health in the workplace. And I guess, there are a number of aspects to that. There's sort of general duties to employees to provide a sort of safe system of work and safe place of work, a kind of health and safety type responsibility. You've obviously got the Equalities Act, which arises and applies in respect of disability in the workplace. And that requires a number of things. Firstly, not to discriminate directly against employees, by subjecting them to a disadvantage because of the disability, not to indirectly discriminate by making it harder for them to access things in the workplace, etc. But importantly, I think for this debate, a positive duty on employers to make reasonable adjustments. I'm sure that's a concept you're all familiar with. And I guess the particular challenge with mental health issues and those legal duties is, to sort of state some obvious points, which I'm sure won't be news to any of you, but it's particularly difficult, I think, for employers to know how to address those obligations in the context of mental health, because the conditions themselves may not be apparent, they're not visible, they're reliant usually on self-reporting by the employee, and the employee's self-reporting may not be very reliable because that's the nature of the underlying condition. The conditions itself are not constant. They often fluctuate. They may fluctuate on a day-to-day basis. So it's not like building a ramp or visibility or sort of access to parts of the building. It's how you then accommodate those conditions is really quite complicated for an employer. And yeah, I think that creates a series of challenges. I guess sort of bringing that back to mental health first aiders, one of the things that I sort of think about in this context is when is the employer on notice of this discussion that an individual goes to have with a mental first aider? Because once the employer is on notice of the underlying medical condition, these duties, particularly this duty to make reasonable adjustments, kicks in. So from a sort of dry legal perspective, one of the things that I think is a bit of a challenge about mental health first aiders is the slightly deliberate, I guess, ambiguity about the nature of the discussion between the person and the mental health first aider. Are they talking to the firm? Are they talking to their employer? What happens after that conversation? Is that conversation reported up with? And Charles, we talked a little bit about that, and I think I think it's quite common to sort of say to the mental first, the first aider, if there's a risk to life, then of course you have a duty to go on and report that. But in most other circumstances, the whole point of the discussion and the thing that allows the discussion to take place is that it's not going anywhere. It's not going to your boss. It's not going to HR. It's not going to impact your career. Now, the problem, I think, from the employer's perspective is the law doesn't really see it like that. A conversation with somebody in a position like a mental health first aider position is a bit like a conversation with HR. Once you've had that conversation, the employer is on notice, really, I think, of that. Now, you may be able to sort of create strictures around that, but there's some rather unhelpful guidance from the Equality and Human Rights Commission that essentially says once your employee has told somebody in authority or someone appointed by you about their condition, you, the employer, know about it. And from that point on, someone comes to your mental health first aider and says, I'm bipolar, or I've got depression, or I've got a stress-related condition which is exacerbated by pressures at work. You as an employer, you're sort of, the clock is running really on you as an employer and your duty to make reasonable adjustments. So I think that creates a real challenge for employers in using these sorts of slightly ambiguous structures. And we can talk about how you get around that. I'm not suggesting that it means you shouldn't do it at all, but I think, a degree of clarity about that is quite helpful. I think the other issue that arises is in making those disclosures, employees may reveal all sorts of other things. They might say, I'm being bullied and harassed by my boss, and that's given rise to depression. Now, we often have this debate with our sort of HR clients. There may be circumstances where an individual brings something to the employer which is sufficiently serious that you sort of really have to go away and investigate it. You have to do something about it, even where that person says, look, I don't want you to take this any further, but at a party last week, my boss groped me. That happens, and the employer will say, well, I understand you don't want to take that further, but it's such a serious allegation, and we take that sort of thing so seriously that whether you like it or not, against your wishes, we are going to have to take that further and investigate it. How do you deal with that in this context? I think that's a really, 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 really difficult question. Maybe the only way to sort of answer that is having a lot more sort of clarity for everybody from the perspective of the person going to the mental health first aider. What are the circumstances in which that first aider might have to pick up the phone to HR? I don't think just limiting it to risk to life is quite sufficient. I think there might be other circumstances in which really the mental health first aider has to sort of report upwards, and tools for the mental health first aider to say, look, actually that issue is really quite a serious one. I think you need to go to HR, or you need to go in this direction, and sort of recording perhaps that they gave that recommendation. So all of that is rather tedious, isn't it? Because it sort of mitigates against this idea that it's an easy entry point for an individual. It's casual, you're not creating forms, you're not creating barriers for the employee to go and have that conversation. But from the employer's perspective, that sort of lack of governance, as it were, around that discussion creates quite a lot of risk and liability. I promised Charles I wouldn't be too
That's really insightful. No,
wary about it. So I think there are, I don't want to give the impression that it's a terrible idea, but I think that, there are some quite substantial risks associated with structures.
Yeah, and lots there to consider in terms of how we can, potentially design and improve practice. And it does give a rise to some challenges. And I know my colleague Sarah and I were yesterday talking about this, because the whole premise of mental health first aid is it's meant to be confidential. It is that safe space for people to go to. It is that, kind of free from concern about the employer finding out. And yet actually in practice, that very nature of that design creates some challenges to consider.
Yeah, but I maybe have a little bit of an issue about the phrase first aid, because I think it's a bit misleading when you compare it to physical first aid. No actual physical first aider says you're having a heart attack, but that's just between the two of us, and if you don't want me to mention it to anyone. So that person would immediately just be the initial point of contact and would of course then go off and get the assistance that is needed. Whereas actually what we're saying here is that this person, the mental health first aider, isn't a gateway automatically to that other help.
Thank you very much. Aaron, if I can turn to you with the next question. I kind of wrote down, we sometimes hear about concerns over the boundaries of mental health care support, but to be honest, it's something we often hear about, that concern that people might overstep the mark. And I'd be really interested to hear your views as a chief medical officer. What are the risks from a clinical perspective? Where do we draw the boundaries, and how do we help individuals kind of put that into practice as well?
Really good question. I think it's incredibly pertinent at the moment as well, just because, as you'll know, we've got a huge number of mental health difficulties affecting numerous people across the country. I mean, we've got cost of living, we've got work stress, we've got multiple demands, financial stress, and that's really permeating through to particularly occupational health. I'm sure the occupational health professionals here will agree that we're seeing a huge number of cases coming through. And so therefore, internally, and the other point to add to that is because the NHS is so under strain, the regular access to mental health support is very limited. And I've had conversations with patients recently where they're in absolute extremis, but they can't access an appointment either for themselves or for a loved one. And then that then translates into a work-based problem, because you've then got an individual who is unable to perform or unable to attend work and is visibly struggling with their mental health. And it then means that your mental health peer support or first aiders, depending on how you classify them within your organisation, it means that they will be having much more difficult conversations. And one of the shocking things that I've seen in referrals is the number of referrals where there is suicidal ideation. And even for clinicians, it can be very difficult to have those conversations. And for someone who's had some training in mental health as a first aider to then have those conversations, there has to be some safeguarding, because quite often, and at this point has been touched on already, is that the very premise of mental health first aiders is that a lot of people who have lived experience will volunteer because they feel that they've got a natural vocation or a natural empathy. But it means that essentially they are then going to be putting themselves at risk if they've got vulnerabilities. So it's, I think we've touched on many of these points already in terms of screening, in terms of who your first aiders are going to be, and then ensuring that they've got adequate debriefing, adequate safeguarding and adequate support. But it is a big risk. And I think that, it's not something that I've seen specifically coming through either from my clients or into my clinics, that I've had a referral saying this individual is a mental health first aider and they're struggling. But, from my perspective, with the way that the mental health climate and the mental health picture is in the country at the moment, it wouldn't be too long before some of those risks then translated through to mental health first aiders themselves.
So that kind of concept of supervision is interesting, more common in the clinical space. Could you just give us a quick insight into kind of what that might look like in a work environment?
So this is something that actually I discussed with one of my financial sector clients before the pandemic. So this is something which, you know, within industry we've been discussing for many years. And actually one of the things that some people tend to do is go externally. So they may look to have trained individuals who will come in and do workshops for their mental health first aiders or debriefing sessions for the first aiders. And that could be at, you know, a monthly level, it could be at a quarterly level, but it just gives the first aiders an opportunity to offload in a way, but also gives rise to training opportunities as well. Because if you know, and I think this is the thing with mental health, is there needs to be that constant revalidation. There needs to be constant discussion, be it informally or more formally, and sharing of ideas. And then at least then you have a level of safeguarding. I think one of the biggest concerns that, you know, and I saw a conversation on LinkedIn recently on this very topic, was that there was just no safeguarding whatsoever. And so mental health first aiders had their training, they went out into the field, they were doing all of these conversations, doing all of this work, but there was no debriefing and there was no duty of care towards them as individuals. And that's a big risk to organizations.
Thank you. Thank you. That's really insightful. Duncan, I'll turn to you next, if I may. IOSH, you lead the IOSH advice and practice function, and as part of the practice, there's quite a bit of useful research that gets conducted in terms of good employment practice. Some of that we referenced earlier on in some of Susanna's great work. Just interested from your perspective, could you give us just some of the headlines of the findings that informs practice in the employment space, and what's IOSH's position on mental health peer support?
Yes, sure. So one of the things that was very clear at the time when we published the mentor piece of research in particular, because it's not the only piece of research we've done in this area, was that it became quite controversial initially, which is not necessarily a bad thing because it gives to robust, constructive discussion thereafter. What is true about it is that let me say before I go into those details, what was true about it was that although it was robust, it did clearly say there are two sides to the argument here, and there is good as well as challenges that are associated with it. So if what I'm saying is going to come over a little bit robust, it's just translating that for you. So the study was led by Professor Avril Drummond from Nottingham University, and was published in 2018, as Susanna said. And it identified that there were some ingredients for success in and around this. First of all, there needed to be some kind of a clear rationale for the training. So what are you training people for? What do you want them to do? You know, how do you choose those people to ensure they're well motivated? And importantly, as we've heard in so many other ways, how are you going to support them? How do you do peer-to-peer support, or as we've heard, other methods like having a key mental health practitioner, occupational health practitioner to support them, or whatever else you're going to do. There is the appropriateness of the role definition. You know, making sure that there are enough boundaries around the particular role, and making sure that they are not overstretched. Because mental health first aiders or peer-to-peer supporters or well-being champions, whatever is the term you choose to use, they're not counsellors, they're not occupational health practitioners. You know, they are there to be able to signpost where other help can come from. And that is so important, because when you're in an emotive situation, you know, people need to know where those boundaries are. That's both the mental health first aider, if I use that term, and also the person who is consulting that individual. They also need to know about those boundaries. So that was called out too. Other barriers that might interrupt the success of your program are things like, do you have an appropriate measurement? So we heard Carl Simons talking about that. It's really important that if we're going to spend the investment in this, that we have ways of being able to measure that performance. And that's not to be hard-nosed and business about it. That is to have the proper information to know whether your intervention is working or not, and if not, what you need to do to make sure that it continues to work in the future. So again, I think Ruth talked about that earlier on. It did show that there was little evidence at the time, and we've heard from Susanna, there's still little evidence about how cost effective this is. But from a colloquial point of view, when you hear people like Carl and Simon and Andy talking on their videos earlier on, you know, there is enough colloquial evidence within organisations where there is a feel about the culture in terms of how it's improved. And again, that came out of Avril Drummond's study, that when you introduce this training into the environment, you do introduce and gain an awful lot of good capital with your employees. But it's how you keep that going and how you support that into the future, which is the really important thing. So many people who perhaps have managed training functions in the past will know that once you introduce a piece of training, that's not the end of the story. You know, you've actually got to have an implementation plan that properly utilizes that training within the organization to be able to make it effective. We also found that through that study that you need to be consistent in your strategies. You know, when organizations introduced mental health first aiders, some of those in the study actually were inconsistent in how they approach things across the whole of their estate. So how you identify, how you train, how you promote the peer-to-peer support, how you put refresher training in place. You know, we have regular refresher training for physical first aiders. So we ought to do something about keeping our supporters, mechanisms for keeping them up to date as well. But it's not all bad news. It's not all just challenges. There are some clear benefits that came out of that. As I say, it proved to be a really good vehicle for raising awareness and a good initial signpost of an intent for the organisation, but the organisation needs to follow it up. So before I come to the last bit, which is about IOSH's view, I think it's important to bring in a little bit of context here as well, a bit of global context to pick up what was said in the introduction. Don't forget that we've as an organisation, as a nation, we're signed up to the United Nations. We're signed up to the United Nations sustainability goals. And within that, there are goals that talk about good workplace, good fulfilling work. And that's in the latter stages of last year, that was followed up by the International Labour Organization, who were talking about health and safety being a fundamental principle and right at work. So there are lots of things coming from our global partners at the moment that IOSH have that is really changing the backdrop for why we should act and why we should act in all matters, not just in terms of physical injury, but also in terms of psychological injury as well. And that is making a difference within the boardroom, because that's making people sit up and take notice, because investors know about that, and investors are asking the right questions about, show me the evidence that you are appreciating that this is an issue, show me the evidence that you as an organization are working towards doing that. But more than that, there are some distinct benefits around recruitment and retention. You know, we have to recognize the fact that Generation Z, or whatever generation we're on at the moment, because I find it at my age difficult to keep up with it. But Generation Z, certainly, you know, they are much less likely to be chasing money these days. They're much more likely to be chasing the ethics of the organization. So if you want to attract talent, if you want to retain talent, then a really important factor in and around this is how you look after people while they're there, and whether they feel that they are looked after in so many ways. In fact, there is a little bit of a thread through all of our pieces of research around the mental health space, that actually those companies that encourage the socialization amongst their employees actually generally have better cultures from a well-being point of view. You know, we're humans, after all, are social animals. So yes, so certainly from the point of view of reducing recruitment costs and building reputation with employees and with investors and so on, there are very good reasons, business reasons, why organizations should get involved. So to IOSH's view, if I may just bring in another aspect here for a second before I go into IOSH's view. Much of what we've heard today has been talking about those kinds of mental health issues that are generated outside of the workplace. But of course, mental health issues can be generated inside the workplace as well. So that's more of our focus. And of course, as an organization, we should deal with both, and we shouldn't discriminate between both of them. But bringing out something that nobody's talked about so far, we should think very carefully about the stressors in our workplace. We should think very much about how we focus on the prevention of those stresses in the workplace. That needs to be part of the plan for the well-being within the organisation. Mental health first aiders, peer-to-peer volunteers, employee assistance programs, all of those things, if you think about it, actually, they're recovery controls. They're not about prevention. That is about doing something when somebody says, I need help. We should be intervening before they get to that stage. And that's, you know, very definitely where IOSH's view is. That's very definitely where the spirit of UK legislation is, that we should be predictive and preventative. So when you are thinking through what your processes are, you should be able to identify what your psychosocial hazards are in your organisation and think about how you're going to prevent them from harming others. So there's lots of questions that you need to ask yourself, like who does a risk assessment and when? How do you consult about with your employees about the content of that risk assessment and the control mechanisms that you've come up with? How do you flex with business cycles? You know, much of my career has been in retail, and boy, we're busy at Christmas and Easter, and then in the summer, everything's a little quieter. So there are business cycles that you need to adapt to. How do you report and investigate incidents? We know how to investigate physical injuries, but do we actually investigate mental injuries? And if we don't, how can we be a learning organisation? What competency needs to be trained and who needs what competency? So there needs to be some kind of a competency framework around this. And how do you measure and monitor the performance once again? You know, so there are lots of questions around this. And in fact, what the Mentor study did and some of the other studies that came up in and around the same time that we commissioned, we actually came up with a free document, which is downloadable on our website, which asks a lot of questions, self-audit questions, if you like, about your system and how you should be building that system up.
That's great.
So.
That's super. Thank you. Thank you very much. And I think we'll definitely be including a link to that in the follow-up so that everyone can access the IOSH material. Thank you, Duncan. That's much appreciated. My next question is for Stephanie, actually. And now thinking about multinational global organizations and increasingly firms such as Clifford Chance who are present in multiple countries are looking at a more common approach to employee health and well-being. My question is that possible from a mental health perspective? Is it possible, particularly from a mental health peer support perspective? Because markets differ, but in particular, cultures and views around mental health and well-being, our kind of level of perhaps sophistication around talking about mental health in the workplace will differ. And Stephanie, at Rolls-Royce, you did launch mental health peer support on a global basis. So just really interested in your thinking behind that, the approach, and also some of the impact that you saw through that program.
Okay, so yeah, so it's definitely a challenge if you work in a global organisation. So controversially, and apologies if this offends anyone, one of the first things I did when I joined Rolls-Royce was got rid of mental health first aid, which was nothing against it, but it wasn't globally applicable for us. It wasn't fit for purpose. I needed something, there's that saying, isn't there? It's okay to not be okay. And I think what we had was, it's okay to not be okay as long as you're in the UK. That's harder to say. But so immediately I saw the need for a programme that was suitable. A big part of the issue is the emphasis on one-to-one conversation, that peer support. If you've got, for example, as Rolls does and as many organisations I work with do, if you've got challenges in America or in Germany, for example, there are medical legal complications where you're not allowed to ask someone why they're off work. You're not allowed to ask them, how are you? Beyond actually almost the very British approach of how are you? Yeah, great. Anyway, which we talked about earlier, you're not allowed to ask those in-depth questions. And culturally, those questions aren't asked. So if you do start asking them, they're not received in the same way that we might in the UK. So I needed to develop a peer support program that was going to be culturally appropriate, medical legally compliant, and support everyone. Because what we found was happening, particularly in Germany and the UK, but also Singapore and some of our other sites, was all the wellbeing program material would go out and people were turned off it because they looked at it and thought, well, I can't do half of that. So we wanted to implement something that was very appropriate for everyone. And that meant linking in to what was available locally, making sure, and we've touched on this already in some of the videos, some of the discussions, that we linked in with local organisations, charities, making sure that when we said, oh, you can go here for help, that there were international organisations, that there were globally applicable organisations, not, oh, here's the Samaritan's number, which is obviously very UK based. And the other thing that I really had to think about, and I'm sure people in this room will sympathise with this, both as a consultant, but as an employee, I was often a team of one. So what I needed from my mental health champions were champions. I needed people that were going to go out there and champion my mental health strategy and help me deliver it and share the messages. I didn't just need peer support. I didn't need one-to-one support. I needed people that were really well briefed in the wellbeing strategy and could go out and deliver this for me. Because as I mentioned earlier, 50,000 employees and little old me, there's only so much impact you can have. And particularly, I was at Rolls-Royce during the COVID period. So any hope of going out globally and shaking hands and doing all that stuff that you might have been able to do before was very limited. So I needed my network more than ever. What I will say worked really well was part of the training for the employee wellbeing champions was linking in with core people in the business. So our colleagues in HR, our anti-bullying and harassment colleagues, our local ethics advisors, all these systems that were already in place in the company formed a fundamental part of the training for wellbeing champions and our mental health champions, so that when people were asking a question, people weren't just saying, oh, you should speak to your ethics advisor, or, oh, that sounds like a line management issue. They were able to say, this is the process you will go to. This is what happens when you speak to your ethics advisor. This is what happens in the anti-bullying and harassment policy that will protect you. So that was a really fundamental part for me, and it worked really well. It kept our mental health champions engaged. It kept the training fresh because there was always something new. So we used to have monthly webinars. We had an active community of practice, which was really powerful, so people could come together and share best practice. We had very clear boundaries. So I'm a consultant clinical psychologist by background, very hot on boundaries. So I made sure everyone was very aware they were not pseudo-psychologists. They were there in this much broader role than just one-to-one peer support. So I really recommend that if you have wellbeing champions, if you have mental health champions, that you integrate them with other key functions within your business so that you're all working together. And the nice thing about that was that they also inter-referred. So if someone was struggling with an ethics issue and someone within that team thought, I think you could use a little bit of mental health support, they could refer to a mental health champion who could also support and advise. So top tip.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. And then finally, just last but not least, thank you for waiting patiently. I think at Lloyds Banking Group, I was really interested that you took a more tailored approach to mental health peer support for certain groups of colleagues, such as your LGBTQ+ group. And I'd be really interested if you could just share with us a little bit about what was the thinking behind that, kind of the drivers behind the need for focusing on particular demographics, and what have the outcomes been for yourselves?
Yeah, sure. So Lloyds is obviously a large organisation, got over 70,000 people. We've actually got a big tailored, we don't call it mental health first aiders, we call it mental health advocates as well. The group didn't like the first aider title. It's quite a big thing, and we've had lots of conversations about it. But so we have about 5,000 advocates across the group, so it's a big number. But we've done a big program of that through the centralised group. But what we in the Rainbow Network, so as it's not my profession and I lead it, it was kind of came on the back of COVID. I'd done a lot of work with an LGBT charity. I used to do the charity work for the network. And that charity is called Mind Out, so specifically focusing on mental health for LGBT people. And from that, we were able to understand that there's a big difference between the statistics around LGBTQ people and mental health challenges compared to the general population. Now, during COVID, we're all locked down, and my job had calmed down a little bit from where it had previously, and I had some time to reflect. And I read a report from the LGBT Foundation, which was specifically on COVID and the impacts and the challenges that the community faced post-COVID and during COVID. And it kind of sparked to me that we're missing a trick here around actually how do we support our network and how do we support our colleagues who actually need the mental health support probably more so than other areas of the bank. So from my perspective, I just wrote a paper and took it into my steerco because that's the way we work in the Rainbow Network. It's really engaged. It's a big kind of group of people that want to do the right thing. And we sort of mobilized a strategy, and it wasn't about advocates alone. It was a full-on strategy like the guys were talking about. It wasn't just, that's just one part of our tailored strategy to support the LGBT kind of agenda. But from that, we started to build out an advocate program and train colleagues specifically with the support of tailored mental health training from our partner, Mind Out, who are known for doing lots of training activity across that space. Developed that program, and since then we've got a training session right now. It's buzzing on my watch as we're doing it. People are talking about it. So we've done 9 training sessions. We trained up to 150 people. And we've got 75 active advocates now that are out there ready for colleagues to go and speak to. Or it's not just LGBT colleagues, it's family members, it's friends, anyone that might need a bit of support. So within the LGBTQ plus kind of spectrum, there's lots of different topics and lots of challenges. We've seen, particularly at the moment in the T space, a lot of our colleagues are struggling more so. And by doing this additional training, focusing on a number of those aspects, we've been able to give a lot of our colleagues those tools to be able to have those conversations. But it's not just about having the conversations, it's also about being visible and showing the support for those colleagues as well. So being an advocate, showing that you understand, you've taken time to listen, has actually had a really positive effect on our kind of network and on the group as a whole. And what we're seeing now actually is we go out with surveys all the time, like a lot of our organizations do, and we did it specifically on our Rainbow Network. One of the biggest, or what I think is the biggest priority that our members ask us to focus on is mental health. And before we did this agenda, we didn't have anything tailored on the mental health other than the odd bit that we would do on Mental Health Awareness Week. We didn't have anything properly tailored. Now, by doing that, I think we've changed our kind of focus as a network, and now it's our top priority because our members have asked us to focus on that. So it's been a different way of learning, different way of taking it. But actually what we're seeing now is Rainbow has led on that. That's our network. We're seeing our Black, Asian, ethnic minority network wanting to do the same. We're seeing other networks wanting a tailored specific support. And as I say, the reason for that is a lot of times people who are gay don't want to go and explain what it's like to be gay to somebody that they go and pick up on an advocate, or even through our EAP line. That's another challenge we've had. We don't want to go for that. Same if somebody is black, they don't want to go through and explain what it's like to be black. People want people to understand because they have that knowledge. So by doing that, you're kind of cutting out some of that kind of discussion and making our colleagues feel a lot more comfortable in that space.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm just quickly checking the time, Lena. We've got some time for fabulous. Okay, so we'll open up to some questions. We've got one on scene at the back.
Hi, thank you very much. That was a really interesting panel. Thank you very much, and thank you for organising it. I just had a question for Alistair. I guess sorry, and I'm Francine Watson from Barclays. Sorry. So my question, Alistair, was about where does risk lie from the perspective of if you're involved from a mental health first aid perspective in supporting somebody, but then through that, you're not actually making sure that that person gets access to the kind of qualified mental health specialist, even from an EAP perspective. Right? How would a tribunal look upon that? So would they say, actually, you've had a couple of days training, so you kind of did your best, or actually you probably prevented that person getting the support that they needed? Does that make sense?
Yes, I don't think there'd be any exposure for the individual, if that's the question. So I don't think there's a world in which the mental health first aider or advocate is themselves subject to some action because they didn't, I think that's not really a risk. The risk really sits with the employer, and I don't think it sort of arises or crystallizes immediately the conversation happens. These things tend to go on over a period of time. But I guess the risks are that when somebody goes to a mental health first aider, they disclose a condition, and perhaps they say that I'm, particularly vulnerable and I have a mental health condition, and that the employer then doesn't adjust the way it's operating towards that person. They load, they might promote them, they load on additional workloads, they sort of add to their stress and difficulties, and that person then eventually goes off sick and leaves or resigns, and you maybe get into a claim situation at that point. So it's really the sort of failure to, I think the risk really comes from that failure to make adjustments and accommodate that person from the point that you know that they have these vulnerabilities and that condition.
Hi there. Another one for Alistair. I'm Claire Fernandez, Chief Medical Officer at the BBC. Just really wanting some free legal advice. So building upon what our colleague in Barclays said, is there any case law that's available on what you've said around perhaps informal peer network support and failure to provide reasonable adjustments?
There's not any direct case law on this question of does telling a sort of peer network impute knowledge to the employer, but there is, I mentioned there's some slightly unhelpful, from the employer's perspective at least, guidance from the Equalities and Human Rights Commission that makes pretty clear that that once you've sort of told somebody who the employer has appointed, including if you tell an occupational health officer appointed by the firm, that imputes knowledge. So you're right, there's nothing specifically on these peer networks and no cases that I'm aware of that relate to these peer networks as yet.
Being very well looked after. Hi, Sally Hemming from EY, Ernst & Young. This is for nobody specific really, but just interesting because I'm not quite sure what I think about this myself, but what's your views on mental health first aid training, given everything we've talked about today, becoming a requirement of employers, which I believe is being discussed on a governmental level? What do you think?
That I think we touched on this a little bit about prevention over cure. I think there should be a requirement for employers to take care of their employees and to mitigate risk and to make sure that the environment employees are working in is supportive of their mental health, rather than a legal requirement for often unpaid volunteers to mop up. Just speaking really bluntly, that would be my kick-off point, gang.
I think I think the label doesn't help. I think you look behind the label. What are the kind of things that you should have in place? You should have a competency framework in place. You should have a clear knowledge about what you want your managers to know, what you want your directors to know, what you want your employees to know, and how these people, whatever label you give them, fit into that picture. I think that is really important in terms of being able to take things forward and to improve culture. It is that sharing of knowledge, I think.
Your people in a management role having a general awareness of mental health issues is pretty essential. I mean, you expect your managers to pick up on an individual that might come to you and say that they're being, other workplace issues. We talked a bit about bullying and harassment and Me Too and other sort of related misconduct in the workplace. People are attuned and know that as a manager, you have a responsibility to pick up on that and deal with it. And this seems to me to fall into a similar sort of bucket. Like as a manager, you ought to be aware of the warning signs. You ought to be aware that, who do I go to? Should I go to HR? Should I involve occupational health? So that seems to me pretty self-evident.
I understand all the reasons why there's concerns around it, and I certainly have my own. But an alternative perspective is I also like the idea that we are moving towards parity between physical and mental health. And if we have legislation around having physical first aiders in the workplace, I can see a place for mental health first aiders on the proviso that we strip back the responsibilities and the expectations of those mental health first aiders really to be crisis response. But I think the reality in practice in our workplaces is we expect much more of our mental health first aiders than that. So from a parity perspective and having that support available in the event of an extreme situation and crisis and often risk to life, I think there's real merit in that. That's my view on the legislation.
We need to look at the bigger picture, essentially, of what we're aiming to do by having these mental health first aiders or peer support programs. And it's not, I mean, in occupational health, we look at the hierarchy of control. And to me, mental health first aid is a bit like PPE, the last point. It's you need to look at the bigger picture, look at the organizational values to try and reduce individuals having to even leverage that support. It should be the last option. And then just, you know, as Charles just said, it has to be a very defined role of what your expectations are for that individual. And my preference personally is that they're used more as a signpost, that this is everything that your organisation has, whether it's an on-site psychologist or an EAP or a private health insurance policy or in extremis 999 or the Samaritans, but not actively trying to support them any other way, because that's where the lines get very blurred.
Just to make one other point, my experience of advising clients on these sorts of issues, there's often a real mismatch between the sorts of people that are interested in mental health first, like the sort of people in this room who are supportive of these sorts of initiatives, and what the business is actually prepared to do. And I think sometimes you do need to have, as an organisation, quite an honest conversation about, there's no point in having these wonderful initiatives that are supported by, you know, us and the sorts of people in this room, if they're not actually then supported by the business side, who say, well, I can't accommodate somebody with stress, I can't accommodate someone who wants to start at 10 o'clock, that simply doesn't work for me, or I can't accommodate this sort, you know. I think you have to be honest and realistic as an organisation about what it is you are really willing to do, and not create a false expectation, I guess, through programs like this.
Okay, cool, thank you. So my name is Grace Jenkins from Mott MacDonald, and I have two questions, which I hope isn't too greedy. But the first one, I suppose, for Stephanie. So I'm just looking at refreshers for our Wellbeing Champion training after having rolled it out in Q4 last year. And I'm looking at the value of, you know, thinking about multinationals, whether we do a refresher for our colleagues in the Middle East and India, for example. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts or, I don't know, experience of that particular part of the world as part of your role at Rolls-Royce.
I think something that has a central thread that ties to your wellbeing strategy but is bespoke. So take into account culture, but also different challenges faced. So my colleagues in India during COVID had a very different experience to myself.
We also have some
their experiences
colleagues
were
for biking.
horrific,
We have
and it doesn't go too
biking
far to say that my
for
colleagues were heroic in the way that they supported and helped each other during that time. So for me, a sort of generic, centrally themed webinar around this is how to take care of your mental health during COVID just was not enough. But the central theme, so that kind of care promise towards your employees ran through everything, but something bespoke. And similarly working, so I work with quite a few organisations in the Middle East, and I find it's just tone and cultural context. If you get that right, the central themes are actually the same, but it's understanding. I work in a lot of male-dominated industries, lots of science, engineering, technology kind of industries, and so you're already up against male-dominated, high levels of neurodiversity, throw in some cultural challenges there, and actually you go in and say, hi, I'm here to talk to you about your mental health, and you can see the sort of fear. I very quickly become the scariest person on the call. So I think it's just making sure that that central thread, so that people feel part of and can connect to your wellbeing strategy. They get it, they think it's for them, they can promote it and advocate it, but you're also not just blanket, you know, generic statementing everything, which it sounds like you're already thinking about. So yeah.
I
Always the tech.
Thank you. I was going to say that really resonates with me working for an engineering consultancy, like everything you just said. But the second question, I guess, to anyone, is thinking about managing or gaining traction for peer support for a timesheet based company, you know, where we're charging out to clients and the real pressure and stress that those people are under. So I don't know if that's a challenge you've come across or can offer any insights like to anyone, I suppose.
I don't want to hog, but I have a lot of experience working in like manufacturing environments, so it's not quite the same, but it is that clock in, clock out. And I found that my, I would say, biggest critics, but who became my biggest allies in the wellbeing, were the operations managers, because they were the people that were responsible ultimately for delivery. And so when I went in and started to talk about, you know, outrageous things like rest, in order to boost productivity, there was this real sense of like, but if my employees are resting, who's putting, you know, the bits together and who's going to get this out of the door? So I'm very evidence-based in my approach, particularly in engineering environments, those sort of things. And I find that if you could go in and show, if you do X, your outcome will be Y, and also pilot it in an area, and then you've got a blueprint for the rest of the company, that worked beautifully. So you sort of ended up with lots of people saying, you should do this, it works, you know, you should rest, it makes you more productive. And you're like, I know. So yeah, I do think there's definitely something in, if you can trial something, get your own evidence base in order to show the rest, then it does grow very quickly. But definitely get your operations managers on side, because ultimately, you know, anyone who's in charge of production, you know, to your point, all the people in this room don't need convincing, but sometimes the person who's in charge of facing off against the client is the one that's a bit nervous about downtime, about well-being, about looking after yourself, not realizing actually it's the fuel for your engine. So in order to meet your productivity targets, you need well staff. So yeah, but always happy to talk further.
I do have a question, but I just wanted to say something. I just have not heard it said today, but I think everybody knows it. It has really helped turning the dial on destigmatizing the whole conversation around mental health. Just rolling out peer-to-peer, certainly in our organisation, which is already moving, thanks to someone to my right, in the right direction. It really helped enable that conversation and move to destigmatizing. But the question I wanted to ask was about, back to Alistair again, sorry. In our organisation, we've been really clear. It's a very simple mantra: listen, support, signpost. They are volunteers. They're not nominated. They're not picked by the organisation. They're volunteers. So with those two caveats, and with the signposting as part of the training, if you need specialist help, go to a specialist organisation. If you've got a bullying, you go to the department that deals with it, etc., etc. Is that not meeting your need to satisfy legal challenges at a later point?
Yeah, I think my concern is around the situation in which the individual goes to the mental health advocate and says, look, I don't want this to go any further, but these are the issues I'm facing. So it's the confidentiality of the process. I think if the individual, you know, if the mental health advocate says, sounds like to me that you've got an issue with your manager, it's pretty serious, I really strongly suggest you go and raise it, and they go and raise it. I mean, there's no issue, but I think the conflict is that these structures are set up so that you can have a confidential, sort of off the record conversation with somebody who's not management, they're not HR. What are they? They're not, you know, they're someone else. But from the employer's perspective, that is still you knowing about whatever it is being disclosed to that person. And if you don't then do anything about it, and the individual doesn't take it any further, then that can create problems.
Yeah, I guess for me, the boundary is supporting the individual to do what's right for them, not doing it on their behalf, because you're disempowering that employee. And
that's true, but you know, the nature of mental health conditions is that people may not see what's best for them. They may really need quite seriously some intervention. They may raise some quite material and serious issues. I mean, yes, if they go and say, look, I'm finding life a bit overwhelming and it's no more serious than that, and then maybe there's not an issue. But in many cases, people do reveal quite serious issues, and the question is, can you just sit on that information? You know, that's you're sort of, you know, to excuse the phrase, you're sort of pregnant with the information. Do you then go and do anything with it?
Yeah, I guess I feel that we do have that covered, and we do have a clinical governance above for the mental health or the peer-to-peer person to go to for those. I just would describe what you're describing as an ethical dilemma, but maybe we differ on that. But anyway, thank you.
Yeah.
I sort of feel that my colleague and I are circling around the same point here. So another one for Alistair. So
I'm sorry.
The answer that's needed, but yeah, go on. I'll have another go.
from my colleague's point, in my world, in occupational medicine, if an employee tells me something and doesn't want it to go to their employer, i.e. they don't ask for a report to be given, then the employer can act as if they don't know because they don't know. Is the point around the peer supporter being an extension of the employer, or could it not be that they're seen as some form of competent help, like an occupational health person, and therefore the employer doesn't know if it's in confidence?
Yeah, but I don't think that, I think that's the problem, because they are employees, they are embedded in your organisation, they're often management, they may not be, but I don't think you have sufficient, I mean, if you had a third party organisation, you had a confidential helpline, then absolutely you've slightly insulated yourself from knowledge. But as soon as you go to somebody within your organisation and say, look, I've got this mate, I'm bipolar, or I've got, whatever it is, then I think the employer is imputed with that knowledge, and then can be criticised for not doing anything about it. I mean, that might seem a bit unfair, but there's lots of case law about sort of imputed knowledge for employers, and then being under a positive obligation to make adjustments to sort that out, and that's the problem with this structure. Sorry. Feel free to ask again, and I'll try and get.
Shall we take a couple on?
Yeah, I have one final question online, and then promise Alistair, not for you, Alistair, well, because somebody else on the panel. It's how much mental health absence is due to workplace relationships, / poor culture. So, we'd like to say that one. We know.
I mean,
Yeah,
Aaron
it sounds
probably.
like an occupational health
Yeah.
question. A lot. I think that's the easiest way of answering it. I mean, we quite often with mental health, it will not be one specific thing that's leading to someone becoming overwhelmed and then going off sick. So I would say that of our mental health referrals, at least half will be solely for work-related stress. But for a lot of cases, there will be multiple things. So it may be physical health concerns plus work stress. It may be personal stress, bereavements and other things, and then work stress gets on top. But I would say that work stress is a significant proportion of the reason why we get referrals in occupational health. And it's one of the things that we now try to do. Instead of medicalising work-related stress, we do try to put the onus back with the organisation to try and resolve the issues first, because ultimately that's going to be the best solution. It's not going to be a medical one.
Duncan, do you have anything to add?
Yes, IOSH's got a couple of studies in this area, looking at bullying and harassment and the effects of that in the workplace, and it is very clearly evidenced through those studies that relationships breakdown with managers is a key driver for people's mental health from a work-related perspective, to break down and be a problem. The other thing that as an occupational health and safety practitioner I can say is that sometimes within your own absence data you can have some clouded figures. You know, so I know that certainly from the retail perspective, quite often you find people would much rather say, oh, I'm off work because I've got a manual handling problem, you know, that I've got a back injury or something like that, when actually it's a mental health problem, but they don't want to bring it forward into the organisation. So it's a little bit more complicated than that. You've got to be really clear about what your statistics are actually telling you, because it might be masking the truth.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. Do you want to join me in thanking the panel? Super. Over to you, Peter.
Yeah, no, thank you, panel. That was a great conversation. I can see where the energy of the room is and about the legal questions. We don't want to become the first case studies, do we, Alistair, or case law? But a really interesting conversation. Lots of big takeaways, I think, from all of that. And yeah, a lot of emphasis of things like culture. I was reflecting my own sort of thoughts when the question Sally raised about government requirements for training mental health. There's far more duties through corporate governance now on the boards understanding the culture of the organisation. And if we know, and as the panel all emphasised in different ways, that culture is one of the big causes of issues around mental health and all these other questions, bullying and harassment, it's been in the press a lot recently. The question is getting asked more and more of boards, what did you know? And it is actually written into the corporate codes from the FRC. It is increasingly, as we've said, an investor view of the companies. So it's all, I think it's coming through those sorts of pressures as well, and how we therefore understand it. Whether the government will require us all to do mental health training, I'm not so sure, but I think absolutely there's going to be this growing pressure for all reasons that we said, that we need to be paying more attention to these things. And whilst I get the points about disclosure and everything else, it's not accepted as good enough to say, I didn't know this culture was going on. It's not acceptable. It's not acceptable for leadership. It's not acceptable even for the boards. So these are very big questions for all of us. And you know, Alistair, thank you for your frankness and honesty and all of the where actually law stands. But I think we've all got more to learn on that front as well. So we've got two more videos to share, so case studies. So the first one, let's look at my notes, make sure I got this right, is from Laura starting at Aon. Yep, I think that's right. So there we go. So Laura said, talking obviously from an insurance and financial services perspective. So let's play her video.
So we've approached mental health peer support in a few ways. So we have a range of inclusion and diversity business resource groups. And in all of these, including the mental health group, there's an enormous amount of support for members, from networking, chat spaces, virtual events, as well as opportunities to share experiences for learning, and importantly, championing for organisational changes that will impact mental health as well as the other interests. Part of the strength of these groups is that they're colleague-led, so we see a huge amount of passion from colleagues who want to help and support others. We have a successful wellbeing intranet site in the Yammer community, and we regularly engage colleagues with our support and our guidance for their individual health and wellbeing, raising awareness on key issues and events. We connect our health and wellbeing story to business priorities for an integrated approach. Specifically, we've trained a group of colleagues in mental health first aid, so they're available to provide crisis intervention and support for colleagues, as well as signposting to mental health resources. So the impact to our organisation has been really from building communities that are very visible and regularly signposted by our senior leaders, and they're very well understood by all of our colleagues. So we track the number of mental health first aider conversations so we can monitor changes and trends and consider alongside our other health and wellbeing metrics to inform our decisions. Feedback from our mental health first aiders who've been able to support someone tells us they're really grateful that we've invested in them and how pleased they are that they've been able to support someone. So firstly, if you're considering mental health first aid, I'd say really understand what the training involves so that you can be clear on your expectations for the role. Approach it holistically. So mental health first aid is not the only thing that you should be doing in this space. So consider how you prevent workers from needing a mental health first aider. So how you reduce the risk of workers requiring that crisis support. Be sure to support your mental health first aider community with ongoing learning, refresher training, as well as really importantly, emotional support for their own mental health, because this might be affected if they're supporting others in difficult situations. To build a community, involve them in your strategy, your goal setting, performance reviews around mental health and wellbeing, and give them a space to connect with each other so they can share their experiences after an intervention if they need to, so they also feel supported.
Great reiteration of messages we've already talked about, the importance of things like refresher training, support for the people who are doing these sorts of things, prevention. We've talked about that quite a lot, came out on the panel. Prevention is always better than cure, right, Duncan? And you're absolutely right. There are so many things we need to think about in terms of creating these safe cultures of support for people so that we don't end up using all the other resources which we know have to be there, but building that idea of prevention to our strategic thinking as well. That was Laura from Aon, and our last one is from Barclays. So Lee Crawley from Barclays. We've got Barclays team up here. Already heard from Francine. So let's play his video.
Okay, so for us at Barclays, our approach to mental health support has been first to address the stigma associated to mental ill health, and second, build capability and confidence in the appropriate ways to offer support. So back in 2018, we made the commitment to becoming a mental health confident organisation. And as part of this, we want colleagues to feel able to openly talk about mental health at work, and for everyone in the organisation to be ready to provide the right support when that happens, and not necessarily restrict those with a specific external badge or qualification. So to achieve this, we focus on addressing stigmas through campaigns such as This Is Me, which we founded, and building capability around mental health and appropriate ways to support with mental ill health and unmanageable stress. So we were also one of the first businesses to sign up to the Mental Health at Work commitment. So therefore, in this way, we take a broader approach to the important idea of mental health peer support. Having said that, learning, development and training is still a key element of this. And although external resources can be useful, but we have found that investing in creating our own offerings has really helped to sort of integrate the recognised best practice approaches with our own internal culture to bring it to life more organically in the organisation. So a few examples of what we offer to support our people, leaders and colleague capability are our Be Well portal, which is our one-stop shop for all of our well-being support information and resources. We have a range of e-learning modules, including around mental health, mental fitness and financial well-being, for example. We have a Developing Our Supportive Culture e-learning program and guidance. And finally, an employee assistance program, which is obviously available to colleagues, but also to managers to get support on how to help their team. Yeah, so from the journey that we've been on and the advice I would give, we break it down, I guess, into 5 key takeaways. So number 1 is scope. So take a broad view of what topics are supported. So our focus on tackling stigma around mental ill health and building confidence in offering support around mental health created a space in the organisation to also service other sensitive topics around well-being that the organisation might need to navigate. We created a Developing Our Supportive Culture guide and some learning to go along with it. And this helped cover additional topics such as financial concerns, menopause, family concerns and domestic violence, to name some. Secondly, the role. So be clear on what role you expect people to play and give them the tools to succeed. So for those offering support, particularly our people leaders, who are in unique positions of trust with regards to those one-to-one interactions with colleagues, they need themselves to be supported in having difficult conversations, around sensitive well-being topics, including mental health. So this is a different role from being a Be Well. This is a different role from being a well-being champion, and that needs to be clear. For example, the role that a leader might have in one of these kind of conversations might be more reactive, more intimate, more unplanned, whereas the proactive cheerleading that a champion may provide, is different, although one individual may actually do both at the same times. So, that said, we do also recognise the role we all have to play in supporting each other, hence our 2-pronged approach. We've got a specific people leader toolkit for wellbeing to help address this and help leaders understand the best way that they can protect and enhance their colleague health within their teams. And then ultimately, we believe we all have a role looking out for one another. And our learning programs show how to spot the signs when a colleague isn't coping and the simple practical ways support can be offered. So number 3, support. Provide a support model that is properly maintained. So as just said, those delivering support need the right tools, but they also need the right support themselves and need to know that support is ongoing. So this should be specific to the needs of those providing peer support in the context of the organisation. You know, it might include regular scheduled drop-in sessions where people can safely share ideas or raise concerns about additional support information they need, perhaps on new emerging topics. And also, I'd say, you know, check out your employee assistance program. That might have a line manager consultancy element, which again, where people can get support on how to then help support others. So training, I think this is a really key one. Take a longer view of how your program might want to develop. So intentionally craft an approach to suit the organization and its colleagues, not simply deploy an external model off the shelf without clarity on, you know, selection, training, purpose, scope, limits of capability, you know, any risks with the handling of confidentiality, etc. One size does not fit all. So if you are using an external training product, you know, consider how that is branded internally. You know, it's great to put that learning into action, but be careful not to be wedded to a specific provider. So fit the training within the program, don't allow the training to be the program. And therefore, any changes to say that provider or changes to the training, it is not material to the overall program. Finally, boundaries. It's a really important one. Clarity about what is not in scope is important as what is. So be clear on the role that your people providing support are covering, but also what they are not covering. So make that explicit for both colleagues accessing support and those providing support to protect everyone.
And now it's a very nice summary, actually, and it's a great one to finish on. So we're pretty much on time. I mean, just a few sort of closing thoughts. I mean, first of all, great to see you all, and thank you all for joining us online as well. I think we've all reflected just how important this is and how important it is that we keep maintaining the momentum and understanding mental health and well-being in organizations. I think we've taken the conversations all the way from the importance of leadership sponsorship, seeing these as cultural dynamics. I think a lot of what Lee just summarized there is really good. I mean, I liked when you talked about removing the stigma, because there's still so much stigma around mental health. We know that societally. But we also know that within our organizations, we've got to create safe cultures and places. So even if people find some of these things difficult to talk about outside of work, we want to try to create environments where they feel more safe to be able to raise them inside of work. So stigma is a very big point. Also, this notion, again, that you talked about, Lee, which is mental health confidence. That actually mental health is everybody's business. And it's a bit like diversity and inclusion. It used to worry me in the past when you said, well, there's the diversity and inclusion champion, so everybody else is great. So it's and it's not. It's everybody's responsibility. So therefore, having training that makes everybody aware, a lot of you talked about it, a lot of the case studies talked about it, of raising that awareness right across the organization, and then making it your own. Yeah, owning it, owning that agenda, owning the language, owning the understanding of how you fit these things into your organization. One size does not fit all. And mental health at work, I mean, just to go to the sources, so very active with that community, Palmer Stevenson report, sort of their leadership council, a lot of great guidance coming through that. So there are many places for us to go for support and guidance. We as the CIPD provide a lot of guidance and training. Obviously, IOSH does, ACAS does, the unions, who we haven't talked about, interestingly, as a channel. The unions also talking about a lot of these things much more. And things like the Mental Health Work Gateway, which is trying to bring together a lot of support for organizations. So there are places for us to go. But I agree with your point, Lee. Let's go to those sources. You don't have to reinvent everything. But make it your own, brand it your own, understanding what's driving your culture. How does it connect to the strategy of your organization? What are the measures that are most going to be impactful in terms of driving these agendas for us everywhere? And then finally, I think just to sort of echo some of the panel points on the legal issues, yeah, this is an important part of what we need to understand. I think the law, as we heard from Alistair, is probably a little bit behind, but I just regard these things, and always have, as part of organizations' duty of care to their people. And as I said, it is getting taught more through things like corporate governance questions. As I said before, that it is not good enough for whether you're an executive or whether you're on a board to say, well, I didn't know that was going on. And we have to know these things are going on, which means that, therefore, cultures of bullying and harassment which exacerbate things like mental health issues, or stress at work, which is exacerbating mental health issues. We have to be aware of these things for good governance as well. So I think it's been a really good afternoon. So lots of good inputs, lots of different ideas. I've certainly written down a whole bunch of takeaways from it. As Carrie said at the very beginning, the purpose of this and through the National Forum is to show that we are doing things, to learn from each other about what to do, not just what to debate. But the debate is important. So I hope you've all been able to take away some good insights, some good thoughts for your own organizations. We keep learning from each other. I think particularly on a subject which we know how important it is, because we've heard from various sources, including Susanna, the evidence base for what works, what interventions most work, we've got to keep building. The best way to do that is to keep sharing. So wonderful to see you all. I think I've landed the plane just about at 4 o'clock, which is when we said we had to finish. So thank you again for all of you who've joined us online. Really appreciate it. Hope you also got something from this as well. Those of you who are in the room, we're now going to have a big tea, courtesy Clifford Chance. But anyway, there is tea outside and available, and I just encourage you to stay and continue networking. So thank you very much.